so glad to be in the place today, and we're wrapping up our series called God is Bigger. And here at Lightning, we really believe that God is bigger than all of our circumstances, that he is bigger than our fear, that he is bigger than our frustrations and our angers in life, that God really is bigger. Amen? And so I'm excited for this word today. I have a friend that I've known since I was, middle school. We grew up right by each other, and it's been awesome to see him step into a pastor role. It's around the same time that I did as well, and it's been so cool to see what God has done through his ministry. Youth pastor, then, stepping into so many awesome arenas within the church in different capacity roles, but then also launched his own church as well, live on Twitch every Wednesday night. And so this guy's a pastor online officially. And so this guy has a word for the church today. He has a word for us, and I'm really excited to see him bring this. And so come on, everybody. Can we give it up for Pastor Mark Lutz as he comes to the stage? Come on.
It's cool to be with Lightning. I've been in the periphery of Lightning since I can never figure out if Lightning started a year before us, at the same time, or a year after. I feel like there was a house church version of Lightning, and then there was a downtown version of Lightning, and then there's a Robinson Lightning, and in some ways I feel like it's the same church embodied in three different places, and sometimes I feel like it's been a fresh look at Lightning each time. My name is Mark. I am the lead and founding pastor of a church called Lux, L-U-X. It's a Latin word for light, taken out of Matthew chapter 5. We are the light of the world, and it's entirely online. I say my last name is Lutz, and our church's name is Lux, because that way people don't think that I just named a church after myself. I struggle with pride, but that's not that badly, evidently. So I pastored for 11 years in a little rural town called Saxonburg. If you know the Knock Knights, that's where I'm from. I actually grew up in the Beaver Valley. Josh and I rode the same school bus together. And Josh is frequent in a story where he said that I made fun of him on the school bus, and he says he remembers it very vividly. I don't want to deny that, because I do remember the painful things that have happened in my past are etched in my memory. But I just want to say that my mom did my hair with mousse until 6th grade. And so if anyone was picking on anybody, I was definitely the low man on the totem pole in almost every circumstance. So maybe I just saw like the one shining moment in my childhood that somebody was below me, and I just latched on to that chance to take Josh down a notch. I'm not sure. My most vivid memory of Pastor Josh is I remember him not being able, and I've told him this 1,000 times, not being able to tell me. He had no idea how old he was. There was this small season where he kept telling me, I have no idea how old I am, which now I've been in third world countries enough now to know that that's acceptable in third world countries, but it is still not acceptable in first world countries for you to be a middle schooler and be unaware of your own age, or at least claim to be. Josh and I were in ministry kind of at a similar season and a similar time in pretty different churches and pretty different experiences, and so and then we launched Lux at around the same time that Lightning was moving into their first building, and had the chance to be part of one of your 12-hour live streams, and have had the chance to put that camera there, online people, and that camera there, and figure out that camera still worked right there in the back a couple of weeks ago. And so now I get this chance to pastor in the online gaming community. I'm a nerd through and through. Pretty much if you like anything nerdy, I've probably done it or been into it, unless you're a Trekkie or a Whovian, and then get out of my face with that. I don't like Doctor Who or Star Trek, and they're just not edgelord enough for me. And I'm going to be going directly over to the mall after this to go to the Four Horsemen comic and board game shop, because I'm not. That's one of the reasons that I like coming to Lightning to do anything, really, is then I also get to go to the Four Horsemen in the Ross Park Mall. And so I've been a gamer my entire life. And now I get to preach to a camera in a studio above my garage, and I get to minister to people all over the globe. Our furthest church family member is Annika, who's in Guam, and she's the farthest because you can't get any further. But we have people in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, Latin America, and all across the United States from coast to coast who call Lux Digital Church their church home. And if that seems foreign and weird to you, don't worry. If you grew up in the church, it probably seems very foreign and weird to you. If you're young enough that you have online friends, it probably seems rather natural to you. And so we've had the chance to be innovative in the church space and do some things that hasn't been done in the church before to figure out how we can reach the next generation in new and creative ways. Because we believe that the next generation that's coming up is increasingly hybrid and holistic, and so we're getting a chance to experiment with that in the online gaming world, which is really, really, really cool. So it gets to blend two of the things that I love the most, which is video games and Jesus. But also in between those two things is my wife, Jennifer. So I've been married now for 10 years, and I have two daughters. I have Brooklyn, who is 6 and is in first grade and is wicked brilliant. And I have Aria, who is 4, who is in preschool with my wife, and she is smart as well, but she's more chaos and burn my house down type of smart than she. There's so many stories, and I'm not going to get into all. I had a dad moment the other day, though, and because I'm going to talk about my father today. I had a dad moment yesterday. I was fixing something downstairs. Now, growing up in Ken's home, my dad frequently went out to the garage to work. Like Sunday morning, right? We'd be getting ready for church, and Dad like, I'm going to go sharpen the blades on the lawnmower, which was code word for I'm going to get ticked off and then not go to church with you. And so I'm downstairs working yesterday, and I had this dad moment. I'm mounting a new electrical box in my basement to run power. Don't think it's like too cool and like hard, like manly. I was running power to my 3D printers, right? And so which I use to print Dungeons and Dragons miniatures. And so I'm running the power down, and I can't get it to work. And I had this dad moment where I was like, you know what I need right now? I need a cuss word, right? I need to get angry at it, and this electrical box is definitely going to get into line if I just holler at it, right? If my wife's like, Mark, from upstairs, because I'm just like getting mad, and it was like, it was such a dad moment for me, having a memory of my childhood growing up. Today we're going to be wrapping up a series called God is Bigger. We've been talking about a wide variety of things that God is bigger than. Pastor Josh is bringing a word. I think you guys had one other guest in this series as well, correct? Yeah. Which is really awesome. We're going to be diving into this and looking at what it means for God to be bigger in our lives, bigger than the things that we're facing, bigger than some of the troubles that we have. Now, I want to be really clear. When we talk about God being bigger in this series, some of the stuff that we're talking about is sort of like, it's not out there, but it's almost cosmic, right? Some of the stuff that we're talking about is almost cosmic. Because when we talk about God being bigger than things in our life, most of us, whether we've gone to church our entire lives or this is our first week inside of a church, we can at least acknowledge that we know that God would be bigger than some things, right? And these are momentary afflictions, right? Issues and things that we face, right? So if you come to church your whole life, or let's just say hypothetically, you've never been to church before and you don't believe there is a God, but you would say, right, if I was to believe that there is a God, like if I was to choose to believe that there is a God, I would probably believe that God is bigger than me losing my job, right? I would probably, if I was to believe in a God, I would probably naturally believe that God is bigger than my relationship falling apart, because I wouldn't want to believe in a God that was smaller than those things. I would probably naturally believe in a God, that was bigger than my divorce, or that was bigger than the issue, or bigger than the loved one that I lost. I'd want to believe in a God, if I was going to believe in one, that was big enough that they could deal with the afterlife in some capacity, right? And so these sort of momentary afflictions that we deal with, whether we're Christians or not Christians, whether we believe in a God or do not believe in a God, we have some understanding, like God is bigger than the momentary things. But for some reason, in our heads, very frequently, the size of God is rivaled by these sort of cosmic larger things in our brain. Right? Things like anxiety, right? Things like fear that we're going to be talking about today, things like shame, things like doubt. These things in us become monumental and rival the size of God. I'm not speaking about the importance of God. The importance of God is rivaled by rather small and insignificant things. Right? The importance of God and priority of God in our life, kind of like where he lands, for me, is sometimes rivaled by a new video game. Like, stupid things rival the importance of God in our life, but few things are cosmic enough to rival the size of God in our life. Size of God in our life. And so let me just give you just a quick thought. And I think this is because of some of the popular thoughts or ideas around God and Satan inside of our culture. Because we sort of have this idea in sort of American evangelicalism of we sort of have the angel on one shoulder, right? And we have the devil on the other shoulder. Or we have this sort of idea of this sort of supernatural cosmic battle that's going on between two rivalries. And we're like, Satan's going to win some battles, but God has the victory. But we still give the image of this sort of this like drag out fight, right, between evil and good. And there's some sort of like a Lord of the Rings level stuff, right? The forces of evil against the forces of the civilized world. And we kind of get this image of these two things that are kind of rivaling and fighting against one another. And it allows other things in our life, like anxiety, like fear, like doubt, like shame, to feel proportionately similar to that of God, right? That there's almost a war, and that they're going to go toe-to-toe, and God's going to come out on top, but there's going to be a fight, which is, by the way, we're going to discuss today, a distinctly pagan way of thinking about God. It's a Canaanite way, it's a Babylonian way, it's an Egyptian way of thinking about the nature of God. God to these things is no more similar in power than if I was to sit here and I was to draw a picture of you, and that picture of you would be able to rival me as a person and my influence. God wrote Satan into existence. He's a created being, and God's immensity can no more be compared to Satan's than my immensity can be compared to a thing that I drew on a napkin and then showed you. And so in our minds, there are things that war against the nature of God, but the Hebrew text and the Bible give this beautiful, beautiful depiction of a God that is so immense, that is so huge, that is so big, that it simply can never be compared in size or in magnitude or in power to anything that we experience in the created order of life. And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to dive in. Let me tell you first a story from my father, because I promised it. So Josh will tell you this. He knows my family. I grew up with a mom and a dad inside the house. I'm a one percenter. I'm a one percenter, guys. I am a white American male with two parents in my house, okay? That's like 1% of 1% of people on the globe. Like top, even as a middle class, kid growing up, like top, absolutely nothing. Like the number of advantages that I've had in life, the number of opportunities I've had in life is unmatched globally, okay? So I grew up with a great family. I grew up with a family who loves me deeply. I grew up with a family that was free from addiction. I grew up with a family that was free from abuse. I had a safe home where my parents sheltered me and shielded me, right? I grew up in the Shire, guys, okay? I was protected growing up. And so I had a really great home life growing up. I had really great family. So, but my dad was the authoritarian. He was authoritative in my household, right? He wasn't brutal, he wasn't evil, he wasn't mean, but he was firm. My father was firm. My mother was too, but my father more so. And there was nothing more terrifying in my life as a child than when I would misbehave and my mother would say, "You are going to tell your father what you did when you get home." Some of us can relate to that. We've had that experience before. Some of us can't. But for me, that was very scary. Okay? Now, my dad had a paddle. I think I experienced its wrath one time. Never again did I test it. It sat and collected dust on top of our fridge, but it was ever working? Yeah. It was at a time? Okay, I just amped up the volume partway through. That makes sense. I would get the summons from my dad, and I would just hear Mark, right, from his bedroom. And there was few things scarier for me than stepping into the domain of my father. Right, there was one thing to get yelled at by my dad in the living room, in the kitchen, outside, in the basement. But there was a difference when I got summoned into my father's room. When I was pulled into my father's domain, my power was so totally and completely eclipsed by Ken. Now, here's the unique thing. I had a great dad. I never once had to fear my father. My father never beat me. My father never wounded me. My father never even used words to wound me as a child. I had a loving, caring, compassionate father, and every time I got called into my father's room, we never did anything more than discuss something. He never did anything more to me than talk to me. But it made no difference. When I stepped in, when I got summoned into my father's domain, When I got pulled into a conversation with him, I trembled. There was some fear. And it wasn't just I was mustering up respect. I wasn't just trying to be like, I better be respectful to Dad because otherwise he'll get more mad. There was a genuineness in my fear as I entered my father's room, and I was eclipsed by my father's power. That's going to touch on what we're going to talk about second today. Today, I'm going to tell you a story from the book of Exodus. It's one of my favorite stories. I'm reading through the Old Testament again right now. And let me tell you, there's some doozies of stories in the Old Testament. I'm going to tell you the story of a man named Moses, and we're going to look at a singular verse here at the beginning. We're going to look at Exodus 14:14. We're not going to pull it up right now. I'm going to get to it later. I know I tricked you there. We're going to look at Exodus 14:14, but I got to give you some backstory here. We're going to take a little trip through Israelite history and also Hebrew symbolism, okay? Because you cannot understand the magnitude nor the significance of the story of the parting of the Red Sea and the situation that the Israelites are in if you do not understand the narrative so far. So in our story so far, God has created the heavens and the earth. From his voice, he drew dry land out of the chaotic, dark waters of nothingness. He creates Adam and Eve, and on page 3 of the Bible, Adam and Eve break God's perfect order. God then gives us a series of stories about the depravity of humankind and the failure of man to realign themselves with the perfection of God. Outside of the garden, they cannot help but hate. They cannot help but murder. They cannot help but tend towards evil. They cannot help but tend towards pride. They try to build a tower to the heavens. And we get the depiction of the slow decaying and depravity of humanity as they are incapable of realigning themselves with the will and the nature of God outside of the garden from which they came. Okay? So God gives us these stories, and actually, so the Old Testament, if you don't know this, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, are written predominantly by a man named Moses, which we're going to talk about today. Most likely, he actually spoke those things, and a scribe wrote those things down. And we know that Moses couldn't have written all the first 5 books of the Bible because you can't write a book of the Bible when you're dead, and Moses is dead for the end of Deuteronomy. He's dead for the end of that, but he wrote traditionally all of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and this is where this is coming from. And so Moses, through the inspiration of God, tells us the story of a decaying humanity until there's a great flood of, once again, the chaotic and dark waters that destroys the world. And by the way, they're not the only one with a flood narrative. There's many other ancient peoples around them. Moses is not just drawing off of something that God spoke to him. He's also drawing off of the surrounding nations. The Babylonians have a flood narrative. The Canaanites have a flood narrative. The Egyptians have a flood narrative. All of them recognize the fact that there was a great flood that destroyed at least their section of the world, and all of them have some narrative with their gods and their pantheons as to why that is. Moses is writing for the Israelites into their history and into their understanding of reality, why the flood happened and how God, their God, preserved them through that. Really interesting stuff. We get a couple more stories, and then we see a new person who steps onto the stage, which represents a new way in which God begins to communicate with his people. The Old Testament shows us ways that God communicates directly to his people. The first way is through the patriarchs. The second way is through the judges. The third way is through the kings. The fourth way is through the prophets. And the fifth way is through his Spirit after the coming and the ascension of Jesus in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost. And so we see the very first player in which God is going to begin speaking through, covenanting with, promising with, and realigning his people in his desire to restore a world that was perfect and has now become broken. And so we see a man who comes onto the scene named Abraham. Abraham has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has a son named Jacob. These three make up the 3 patriarchs, where we see many times in the future that the Hebrew God is described as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. These become the patriarchs and the fathers of the faith, and Jacob has 12 sons and daughters, but 12 sons. And one of the youngest sons is a beloved son named Joseph. And you've seen Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, so you understand the premise of the story. Joseph gets sold into slavery. What his brothers intended for evil, God redeems for good. And he brings his people out of a land that was promised to their forefather, Abraham, and he brings them into the land of Egypt, and he settles them into a beautiful land in Egypt called the land of Goshen. And God uses the land of Goshen to take a family and incubate a nation. He takes a family into Goshen, and he incubates a nation inside of Egypt. So much so that the Israelites populate so much and so rapidly that years later, the Egyptians become fearful of them, and with new rulers in Egypt that have no memory of the goodness of Joseph, one of their forefathers, they begin to enslave the Hebrew people. And for 400 years, the Hebrew people live as slaves to the Egyptians, making bricks to build cities. Now, you hear all that, and when we think of enslavement, we think very distinctly of the history of enslavement in the United States. But that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a bondage that is different in type. It's different in type, but it's also different in intensity. To be a slave to a foreign nation during a season where every person on the planet was pantheon. They thought in the form of a pantheon. In other words, multiple gods, right? The Canaanites had a god that ruled over their land. The Babylonians had a god that ruled over their land. The Egyptian had a pantheon of gods that ruled over their land. And the Hebrews had a god of their forefathers whose name they did not know, that has abandoned them in Egypt. And they've been there as slaves for 400 years. Every Hebrew is a Hebrew that believes in more than one God at this point in history. God has not given them the 10 Commandments. God has not displayed himself as the one and only God. He is a nameless God of an ancient ancestor that has not freed them from slavery for 400 years. And to be enslaved to the Egyptians is not just to be a slave to the slave master, but it is to be a slave to the Pharaoh. And to be a slave to the Pharaoh is to be a slave of the voice and the physical representation of the gods. We live in a world where there's separation of church and state, but in the ancient world, that was not the case. If you were the king, that means that you were the representation of the gods of your people. You were their spokesperson, you were their avatar, you were their representative. What you spoke was the very religious truth and political truth of your people, not just for these people, but also for the ancient Hebrews. So their understanding of faith and government were so intimately intertwined that they could not possibly be separated. So as an ancient Hebrew, you are 400 years enslaved, not just to Pharaoh, you're not just building cities, you are also enslaved to Ra and to Set and to all of the other pantheon of Egyptian gods. And all of them display to you every single day that you are inside of their domain, and the God of your ancestors, whose name you do not even know and you have no understanding of, has no power at all to free you from underneath the boot of the gods. You are cosmically enslaved. You're not just enslaved to a flesh and blood owner, you are enslaved to a deity. And in Egypt, a grouping of deities. So we see Moses come onto the scene. He is an adopted prince of an Egyptian, exiled into the wilderness. 40 years as a shepherd, he encounters God in a burning bush, and God sends him, a stutterer, and his brother Aaron to free the people of Israel. And Moses says, "What is your name?" And God says, "My name is I am Yahweh. And you are to go to a group of people who do not know me, and you are to say, I am coming on behalf of the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who has left them enslaved for 400 years, who has never given them a name, and I'm going to free you from not just the Egyptians, from not just the Pharaoh, but also from the Egyptian gods." And obviously, many of the Hebrews, who likely are Egyptian god worshipers at this point because they've grown up in Egyptian culture, they've only known Egyptian way of life, right? They don't believe him. And so God begins to demonstrate plagues. A lot of people ask, why did God harden the heart of Pharaoh in the book of Exodus to perform the plagues? Because in every single plague, God is displaying his control and his divinity over the cosmic forces of the Egyptian gods. Let me just give you an example. Okay, so let's do this. Moses, I'm going to find it. It's in my notes, right? Moses delivered the plague of blood, which is whenever he turns the river of blood, is against Hapi and Osiris, the Egyptian gods of the Nile and of death. The plague of frogs is against Hequet, which doesn't mean anything in English, but for me, we're going to call it a Hecate. The Egyptian god of fertility. The plague of the dead livestock is against Apis, the god of livestock. The plague of hail is against Set and Horus, the gods of sky and storms. And the plague of darkness is against Ra, the god of the sun. These are not happenstance. They're not randomly chosen. God didn't flick open his book of plagues and doom, we're going to do this one today. Every single display of power that God does in Egypt is a direct attack on one of the domains of divinity of the Egyptian gods. God is not displaying to the Hebrews, I can free you from slavery to Pharaoh. That doesn't seem very outrageous for a God. He is saying, you don't just view yourselves as slaves to a man, you view yourselves as slaves to a God, to divinity. And I will display to you that despite the fact that you've been in slavery for 400 years to these gods, that I am more powerful in every single domain that they dominate. The Nile is the embodiment of one of the gods. He turns it to blood. The sun is the embodiment of Ra. He turns it to darkness. In every area in which the Egyptians held a foothold of divine power over their Hebrew slaves, God displays himself in power and shows clearly that he is a greater and a bigger God. This incredible display, and God hardens the heart of Pharaoh over and over again until he can write a love letter to his people and show clearly that they can trust him to deliver them from slavery, not to Pharaoh, but to the gods of Egypt. He then leads them out and they plunder Egypt. Literally, the plagues come. The Egyptians are so favorable towards the Hebrews that they give them the silver and gold and jewels that they have. They plunder the nation of Egypt without an army, and they're marched into the wilderness. And God leads them by a way that they should not go. He leads them to the Red Sea. And at the Red Sea, he hardens the heart of Pharaoh. Now, we know he's hardened the heart of Pharaoh before to display that he has power over the various gods of Egypt, but he's about to put on an entirely different level of display. And he's going to communicate to the Hebrews that he is more powerful than something that's substantially bigger. Because there's nothing inside of this story that doesn't have symbolic meaning for an ancient Hebrew, okay? So he leads them out to the Red Sea, and they camp along the Red Sea. Pharaoh's heart becomes hardened, and he leads his chariots and his army to recapture them. And it tells us that the people begin to panic. They're caught with their back against the sea, and their front, right, their return home is an Egyptian army, of which is one of the most powerful in the world at the time, and they cannot hope to conquer. The Babylonian army and the Egyptian army are rival armies all throughout the Old Testament narrative in terms of their power and their desire to sway the Israelites to side with one or the other, and their desire to enslave or exile them. And so the Egyptian army is very, very powerful at this point in history. So they have no hope. And in Exodus 14:14, there's this really powerful verse, one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Moses stands up and he says this. Now you can put the slide up there. He says, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Now try to imagine the panic. Try to imagine the fear of a Hebrew in this scenario, where you're dealt the cards of swimming across the Red Sea or turning to fight without weapon and without training against the most powerful military force on the planet, with the exception, or at least in your section of the world, with the exception of maybe the Babylonian army themselves. Imagine the fear. I mean, listen, I don't know about you. I'm sure there's some times in life you may have walked in, you're between a rock and a hard spot right now. You really feel like you're facing down. You're between the army and the sea. Maybe you're here today and you're like, listen, my marriage is a sham. It sucks. I hate it. I hate the person that I'm with. I'm unhappy. They're unhappy. My kids are suffering because we're unhappy, but if we divorce, they're also going to be unhappy. I'm between a rock and a hard spot right now. Maybe you're here today and you're like, everything's getting substantially more expensive. I've lost my job. My job doesn't pay me enough money to make my bills a year ago, and because everything's more expensive, I need to find a job that pays me even more. I can't find a job. The bills are stacking up. I'm between a rock and a hard space right now. You might be here and you're like, man, I'm in the middle of an addiction, but I'm serving at this church. And if I ask for help, I'll be removed from the position that I'm in. I just know it. I can't confess it. But if I don't confess it, I can't find freedom. I'm between a rock and a hard spot right now. There's some of you guys, you're walking in here today and you're just faced between two pretty harsh realities. And you're just like, man, I'm not sure which way I'm supposed to go. I'm afraid of what the results are going to be. I'm either getting pushed across the water or I'm surging into people that want to enslave me and capture me and kill me. I don't know where to go. I'm stuck. And God is saying in Exodus 14:14, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Now, let me just be clear, because this has so much more symbolic meaning than just water and an army. Okay, we know what the Egyptians represent. We know that they represent enslavement to an Egyptian pantheon. We understand all of that. But God has a plan. There's a reason that God took them by the way of the Red Sea, and there's a reason he hardens the Egyptian heart. And here's why I think it is. The deep and dark waters are representative and evocative of so many things in an ancient Hebrew's imagination. And not just an ancient Hebrew's imagination, but an Egyptian's imagination, a Canaanite's imagination, and a Babylonian's imagination. Let me tell you what the Babylonians believe at this time. The Babylonians believe that their God went to war with a sea monster. The sea monster's name is Tiamat, and when he goes to war with Tiamat, he slaughters her and flays her. When he flays her, he lays her top flay in the sky, and her congealed blood droplets become the stars, and he lays her bottom flay along the ground, which rises up out of the sea, creating dried land, and her congealed blood droplets there become human life. And this sea monster slaying myth is lived out in the Canaanite story at harvest every year. The Canaanites believe that a great sea monster comes out of the sea every year, out of the chaotic, deep waters of the sea, and their God, the God of storms, slaughters the sea monster every year to bring harvest to his people, and he lays it out upon a mountaintop where he invites his devotees to come and feast. The Egyptians have a similar story with a monster of the Nile. There is this story repetitively throughout the scriptures. And actually, if you look in Genesis chapter 3, it says that when God creates the waters and he puts life in them, it says he creates the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the great Leviathan, the sea monster in the sea. Everything around the Hebrews displays a God that rivals and competes in power with the powers that are in this world, the chaos and the destruction and the disorder, except the Hebrew God who depicts a thing that creates it as though it's nothing and tosses it into the sea. Okay? So there's this beautiful depiction of what's going on. But let me just give you an idea about what the chaotic waters of darkness represent. Because for us, it says in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, I'm going to read it to you. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, to our imagination, in a world of submarines, we just picture, man, the world was just this sort of ball of water. But the symbolic meaning here for an ancient Hebrew is it was chaos and nothingness, decreation, deconstruction, and death. The closest thing a 2023 brain can get to imagining what an ancient Hebrew brain imagines when they hear this is outer space. The nothingness, the void, and the darkness, and the death of what it would be like for us to be cast into the outer places of the universe. For them, they watched as the waves lapped and attacked the ground, the earth, from which they lived every day. They were never able to adventure beyond being able to see land because they couldn't navigate the waters. If you went underwater, you drowned and died, and you were pulled down to a place of darkness. This is echoed in the book of Jonah, whenever he's in the belly of the whale, and he writes a poem about being pulled down by the tendrils into death. This is echoed all throughout the story. God and the Hebrew writers use the imagery of dark and chaotic waters to depict death, chaos, and decreation over and over again. So now you are a Hebrew people, and you are caught between the enslavement of the pantheon of gods that has held your people captive for 400 years, and God has displayed his power against, in the chaotic and primordial cosmic waters of death, destruction, and decreation that stand behind you. There's a reason God put them on the Red Sea. And in this moment, God says to Moses, extend your staff. He extends his staff, and God sends a pillar of fire to defend them from oppression. And he sends a wind all night to take dry land out of chaos, death, and decreation. He pulls them and plucks them and displays his power and mightiness, his magnitude and his scope, now not just against an Egyptian pantheon, but against the primordial forces that the Egyptian pantheon is written against, that they contend with. He's writing into them his power and his magnificence and the scope of his greatness over top of the primordial waters that the Babylonians and the Canaanite gods contend with. He's showing, I'm not just fighting against the rulers of this world. I'm not just an answer for the primordial nature of the earth. I am over it. I've created it. I am bigger than it. I can do anything that you think I can't do. I am more. And here, the ancient Hebrews walk through the depths of the water on dry land. There is this unbelievable and beautiful symbolism here that God is bigger. He's bigger than our fear. He's bigger than what we're facing. He's bigger than our addictions. He's bigger than our broken relationships. He's bigger than our past. God does not contend with your fear. He doesn't contend with your anxiety. He doesn't contend with your doubt. He doesn't contend with your shame. These are not forces that he wars against. He is so much immensely bigger than anything that we have given cosmic power to in our brains than we could possibly think or possibly imagine. This is the God that we serve. This is the God that we know. Listen, if you're here today and listen, in the book of Revelations, is a really interesting passage. Right towards the beginning, John is writing, and he gives a list of the things that will prevent you from entering into the kingdom of God and possessing it. And what's on that list is what you would think, right? The adulterers and the sinners, the sorcerers, the murderers. What's really interesting is at the very beginning, one of the first things that John says is the cowardly. The cowardly, which is not typically the sin that we would associate with not being able to possess the kingdom of God. Now, granted, John is exiled on the island Patmos at this point in his life. A lot of Christians are being arrested and tortured and told to deny Christ and hail Caesar. And some of them are choosing to, and some of them are choosing not to. And those who choose to hail Caesar are oftentimes excommunicated from the church, right? Because if they will deny Christ in the face of torture and certain death, they're not worthy of the cross of Christ. And so he's just saying, listen, the cowardly will not inherit the kingdom of God. But there are a lot of things that we are afraid of today. And cowardice, I think, is the number one sin inside the church. I think it's the thing that primarily prevents us from living into everything that God intended us to be. And I believe that most of us just don't want to recognize it. 2020 came around, and everyone just accused everyone of being afraid of something while everyone was afraid of something. I don't think I've been more afraid for the future of my children than in April of 2020 than I've ever been. But let me tell you, if someone told me that I was afraid, I would have been very quick to point out how afraid they were. But I'm not afraid. Super brave. I don't lay awake at night, unable to sleep, worried about the future of my children. You're preposterous. You're afraid. You're afraid, man. It was like all of 2020 was people just basically on social media in person. You're the one who's afraid. I'm not afraid, man. I'm totally cool. I'm super brave right now. When we're all super afraid. We're all super afraid. The world's a weird place, guys. The Gaza Strip attacked Israel yesterday. If there's a place where World War III starts, let me just tell you, it's Israel. Because every player in Israel has another world power that stands behind it. We're heading into another election year. Most of us don't actually know the last election year ended yet. Most of us are still somewhere reeling from and trying to recover from and catch our breath from 2020, and we're heading into 2024, and we're in for another cycle. The U.S. government is acknowledging the existence of extraterrestrial life on YouTube. It's a weird place. There's a lot of things right now in life to be afraid of, and fear controls and manipulates us. And if our enemy can convince us that maybe he can't beat God, but his size and scope can challenge God, that he can contend with God, then he can occupy a bigger part in our spirits and in our hearts and ultimately in our church. Fear doesn't have a place in God's kingdom. We must be free of it. So then, okay, let's just talk about this. Let's go to part 2. Let's talk about how do we get free of fear. What does it actually look like? It's great to say, stop being afraid. But to say stop being afraid without giving you any clue about how you stop being afraid. And I'm not talking about fear like jump scares, like going to a haunted house. I'm talking about belly of your soul, the center of who you are, the fears that speak about the future of the world, the fears that talk about your inadequacies, the fears that talk about what if they find out. Those fears, the darkest places, the hardest and most, the fears that speak to me. Mark, you're a church planner, but you're probably a failure. Those fears, those things that come out of my soul. Mark, you're probably handing things down to your children that they're going to be in counseling for someday, right? Those fears that come out of the depths of who I am, the things that I don't utter to a lot of people, the things that I don't like to speak publicly. Those fears, how do we actually contend with them and put them in their place, not as cosmic forces to contend with God, but as tiny things drawn upon a napkin in the scope of the greatness of who our God is. Now, there's this passage in the book of Proverbs. So when you talk about fear of the world, you cannot stop there. You have to talk about the fear of the Lord, which is not a super fun subject inside a church. Let me just be really clear. No one likes to preach on it. We're going to talk about it. So there's this passage in the book of Proverbs. It says this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. It's like, okay, well, we want some knowledge, we want a little wisdom. What does the fear of the Lord mean? Well, listen, a lot of times inside of church, especially I think in American evangelical church, the fear of the Lord is not a real palatable idea. It's kind of ugly. It's like, why would I be afraid of God? Jesus loves me. But you guys know Jesus loves you. He loves you so much, and he does. Then why does the Bible say that I should fear him? I don't fear the people that I love. I beg to differ. You probably do in some cases. So let me just take a look really quickly here at a couple of passages where we see the fear of God lived out, both one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament, and you tell me like this seems like mustering up some respect or finding some reverence. Okay? The first one is going to come to us from the book of Daniel. The first one's going to come from the book of Revelation. The second one, Daniel. This is John again. Before he writes this thing about cowardice in Revelation, he says this when he first encounters the beauty and the magnificence of a resurrected Jesus. He says, when I turned to see who was speaking to me, I saw 7 gold lampstands, and standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. He was wearing a long robe with a gold sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice thundered like mighty ocean waves. He had 7 stars in his right hand and a sharp double-edged sword that came out of his mouth. It just gets scarier and scarier and scarier. Okay, a guy with white hair, got it. Sword out of his mouth, I'm not sure. And his face was like the sun in all of its brilliance. Couldn't look at it, right? When I saw him, this is John, Jesus' closest friend, experiencing Jesus in his resurrected form. He says this: when I saw him, I fell at his feet as if I were dead. But he laid his right hand on me and said, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I died, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and to the grave. Now, to me, when John sees his best buddy and he falls on the ground as though dead, that doesn't seem like reverence. That seems like he's actually scared. That seems like some genuine level of fear. Let me give you another story. This one is from Daniel's Old Testament, in case you think there's 2 different versions of God here, right? I'll give you a story from Daniel. Daniel's living in exile in Babylon. He's underneath of the Babylonian God, right? God has abandoned his people to be oppressed by not just Nebuchadnezzar the king, but he's also the spokesperson for the Babylonian deity, right? And so they are oppressed by the Babylonian deity, finding themselves in another proverbial bondage like Egypt, like their ancestors, right? And Daniel is serving God, and Daniel experiences an angelic visitor, and it says this: I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and they hid themselves. We've got We got some companions here, don't even see the vision. They don't even see the angel, but they're so scared, they run away. That doesn't seem like reverence. I don't run away from things I revere. I run away from things that are scary to me, right? Like bears and things. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face on the ground. In other words, Daniel was so terrified at this vision that he passed out. He just fainted on the ground on the shores of the river, okay? It says this, a hand touched me and set me trembling. Still doesn't sound super not scary. On my hands and knees, he said, Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I'm about to speak to you and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood trembling. Still sounds pretty afraid. Then he continued, do not be afraid, Daniel. Another, do not be afraid. Since the first day that you set your mind again, to gain understanding and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. There's a whole story about spiritual battles and spiritual beings in physical locations here that we're not going to get into. But the point is, Daniel prays. God hears, he sends a messenger, and that messenger ties up with the spiritual prince of Persia, representing the spiritual kingdom of Persia, representing the deity of the Persians that will eventually overtake and conquer the Babylonian Empire. So we get a little bit of a foreshadowing there. He said, then I continue, do not be afraid, Daniel. Oh, no, I already read that part. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, one of the chief angels, the archangel Michael, because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come. While he was saying this to me, I bowed my face towards the ground, and I was speechless. Then one who looked like a man touched my lips and opened my mouth, and I began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I have overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and I feel very weak. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. Again, the one who looked at me looked like a man who touched and gave me strength. Do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed, he said. Praise, be strong, be strong. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, speak, my Lord, since you have given me the strength. Daniel encounters an angel, and then he encounters one who looks like a man who is very clearly a depiction of a Savior, Messiah, Jesus figure, whether that is actually Jesus or not. And he says, here, I want you to be strong. But Daniel is so weak that he passes out. He's so afraid that he can't speak. He's trembling when he stands. He's on his hands and his knees just before an angelic messenger. To me, this does not describe the type of God that you try to respect. When you come face to face with God and you step into his domain, your power is so utterly eclipsed, it won't be a decision to fear him. You will fear him. But just like I stepped into the room of my father, trembling as a child, you at the same time have nothing to fear. Let me just tell you, the path to freedom from fear is only found in the fear of the Lord. That's it. When I was in college, I had gone through a season of life where I had walked away from the Lord and abandoned the faith. I didn't believe in Jesus anymore. I just didn't want to verbalize it because I thought it would be embarrassing. And there came a point when I was in this pretty unhealthy relationship, and I came to an end one night, and I was pretty broken up about it. And I flipped open my Bible for the first time. I was in Bible college for the first time in several years to actually read it for a reason that wasn't writing a paper. And I flipped open to the very beginning of the book of Psalms, and I read Psalms chapter 1, where it talks about trees who were planted by streams of water. And I recognized in that moment that despite being a Christian since I was 8, that my tree had not been near a stream of water in quite some time. That I was like the chaff in the wind that would be blown away at the wrath of God. And it was in that moment that I came in some version or form, spirit to spirit, face to face. The veil of eternity became thin in my parents' basement bedroom, and I was standing before a God who loved me, but I have never been more afraid in my life. I've never had the experience again. I've been like inside of an abandoned fairground in like a storm while the sirens for a tornado are going off, and I'm all alone in it. Not even joking. That actually happened to me. That was scary. Nothing like being in front of my Creator. Right? I've had moments where my daughter last year was in the hospital. We didn't know what was wrong. She was 3 years old. She's hooked up to all of these IVs. The doctors can't figure it out. We got all these different diagnoses. We think she might have cancer. Nothing compares to the utter gut-wrenching and deep spiritual fear of being in the presence of my Father. And literally that day, I fell on the ground in my parents' basement, and I wept a nasty type of weeping where there's snot from face to floor, right? And I'm just like, I'm heaving in this place, and in the experience of total and utter fear in the presence of my failure, knowing that not only was I condemned to death because of my sin, but that I deserved it full out. That my wretchedness deserved punishment. It was in that place that I experienced also unspeakable love. And it was coming out of that place of fear that I realized that in the presence of the immensity of a bigger God, that I had nothing this side of eternity to be afraid of. Because when you step into the presence of the immensity of God, and you hear him tell you, but be not afraid, which is uttered to Mary whenever she encounters an angel and being told that Joseph is going to be born, which is given to Daniel, which is given to John, which is given to Moses, which is given to Elijah, over and over again, they come before the presence of God in sheer terror, and over again they hear, be strong, be courageous, and do not be afraid. This is not because they're not afraid. God is challenging and encouraging. Listen, if you don't have to be afraid of me, you need to be fearful of nothing. The answer to fear of the world is recognizing the fear of a God that is bigger. I'm going to close with this, and then I'm going to pray. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's one of my favorites. C.S. Lewis writes this is a conversation with, I think, the fawn and the boys, the children, about Aslan, the lion. It says this, Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was like a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he is good. Creating a safe God is a God that we can control and box in. Encountering the real God is freedom from the fear of bondage, death, destruction, all things that this world can leverage against you. It's the same fear that the apostles encountered that led them to be martyred. And it's the same fear as countless others in our rich tradition of faith have encountered and lived fearless lives, serving the Lord and entering the kingdom. Your battle against fear isn't to go out against the world and to prove that you're strong and courageous. It's to lean heavily into the immensity of the Father and to spend time in his presence.